Welcome back to HOA Rulebook. The board called it compliance, and I called it extortion. I tried to leave for work, and Martha planted herself behind my car, yelling that I was violating the snow emergency parking restriction, and she would call the tow driver back unless I went inside and shoveled first. "Your mailbox access is blocked, and I am fining you for it," she yelled. Her thin reading glasses perched on her nose for maximum dramatic effect, one gloved hand raised like a traffic cop. I was already 20 minutes late, and my first service call was across town. I gripped the steering wheel and checked my watch for the third time in 2 minutes. The snow emergency had been declared at 4 in the morning, and I had cleared my driveway before dawn, but fresh snow had drifted back over the edges while I was inside grabbing my tools. Madison had been hit with 8 inches overnight, and the plows had shoved another foot of berm ice across every driveway apron in Golden Oaks HOA. Martha did not care. She stood there in her black parka with the hood up, breath steaming in the cold, pointing at the 2-inch layer of snow that had blown back onto my cleared path like it was a felony. The tow truck was already idling at the curb, diesel rumble cutting through the wind. I could see the driver in the cab waiting. Martha had called him before she even came to my door. She wanted me to see the threat, to feel the pressure, to know she could take my car whenever she wanted. I work as a pool service technician, which means I understand HOA politics better than most residents. I have seen boards abuse vendors ignore maintenance and pocket reserve funds. I moved to Golden Oaks 3 weeks ago because the rent was cheap and I thought a master-planned community would be stable. I was wrong. The board runs snow patrol after every storm, and Martha Clark is the neighborhood watch liaison who treats every resident like a suspect. She had been waiting for me to slip up. I got out of the car, shovel still in hand from my pre-dawn clearing session. The wind bit through my jacket and I pulled the hood tighter. Martha did not move. She stood blocking my bumper, her boots planted in the snow. "You are in violation of the Winter Emergency Vehicle Placement Addendum," she said, pulling a folded paper from her pocket. "This conversation is not a debate. It is a directive." I did not recognize the addendum. I had read the CCRs when I signed the lease, and there was nothing about mailbox access fines or emergency vehicle placement. I said as much. Martha smiled, the kind of smile that means she has been through this script 100 times and she knows how it ends. "Keep arguing, you are making my case for me," she said, tapping the paper with one finger. "Every word you say goes in the report." The tow driver stepped out of the cab, walking toward us with a clipboard. He looked cold and annoyed, like he had been roused from bed for this. Martha waved him over. I felt my chest tighten. I could not afford to lose the car, and I definitely could not afford whatever fees and surcharges Martha was about to invent. I had just moved in, I was still catching up on deposits and utility hookups, and a tow bill plus storage fees would wreck me for the month. "I need to get to work," I said, keeping my voice level. "I cleared the driveway at 5 this morning." "This is just drift snow." "Drift snow counts," Martha said. "The addendum is clear. If your mailbox access is obstructed, you are liable. The fine is $200, and if the tow proceeds, you will also be billed for dispatch, labor, and administrative review. $200 for 2 inches of snow that blew back in the last 30 minutes. I checked my watch again. I had to meet a neighbor witness at the mailbox cluster before the next storm wave hit, because I knew this was not going to be the last time Martha came after me. The forecast called for another 4 inches by noon. I made a decision. I acted like I was backing down, because timing was the whole weapon. I told Martha I would re-shovel, and I asked her to call off the tow. She hesitated, then nodded, pleased with herself. She pulled out her phone and told the driver to stand by. I grabbed my shovel and started scraping the driveway again, working fast, every stroke burning through minutes I did not have. Martha watched me the whole time, phone in hand, counting every scrape like she was timing a penalty. The tow driver leaned against his truck, smoking a cigarette, clearly unbothered. I finished in 6 minutes and tossed the shovel onto my porch. Martha walked a slow lap around my car, inspecting the edges of the driveway, then checked the mailbox cluster 20 feet away. She nodded. Acceptable, she said. But the fine stands. You will receive the notice by end of business today. She walked away before I could respond, her boots crunching through the snow. The tow driver climbed back into his cab and rolled out, leaving deep tire ruts in the slush. I sat in my car, hands shaking, breath fogging the windshield. I was already late, and now I had a $200 fine hanging over me for snow that had blown back on its own. I pulled out of the driveway and headed for my first stop, but my head was spinning. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong. The addendum she had quoted did not match anything in my lease documents, and the tow threat had come too fast, like she had been ready to pounce. I decided to stop by the HOA management office that afternoon and get a copy of the actual rules. The day dragged. I missed 2 service windows because of the delay, and my supervisor was not happy. By the time I finished my last call, it was almost 4 in the afternoon and the next storm wave was moving in. I drove straight to the management office, a small brick building near the community entrance sign. The lot was empty except for one car, and the lights inside were dim. I walked in and found a clerk at the front desk, a young guy in his 20s who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. I asked for a copy of the Winter Emergency Vehicle Placement Addendum. He frowned and typed something into his computer. "We do not have that on file," he said. I described what Martha had told me, including the mailbox access fine. The clerk shook his head. "That is not in the master covenant. The only snow rules we have are the standard sidewalk and driveway clearing requirements. No fines for drift snow or mailbox access." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked if he could print the actual snow policy. He handed me 3 pages, and I scanned them right there. Nothing about mailbox access. Nothing about emergency vehicle placement. Nothing about $200 fines. I asked the clerk who was authorized to issue fines. He said only the board could vote on violations, and even then they had to follow the hearing process outlined in the bylaws. He pulled up the board roster. Martha Clark was listed as Neighborhood Watch Liaison, not a voting member. She could file complaints, but she could not unilaterally fine anyone. I asked if there had been other complaints about Martha. The clerk glanced around like he was checking for cameras, then leaned in. "Off the record, yeah. A lot. But the board president backs her up every time. People usually just pay the fines because fighting it costs more." I thanked him and walked out. The wind had picked up and snow was falling again, fat flakes sticking to my jacket. I sat in my car in the parking lot and stared at the printed policy pages. Martha had lied. The addendum did not exist, and she was not authorized to fine me. But she had a tow truck ready to go, which meant she had some kind of arrangement with the vendor. I needed proof. I called the tow company from my car and asked to speak to dispatch. A woman answered, and I explained that I had been threatened with a tow that morning in Golden Oaks. I asked if they had a contract with the HOA. She put me on hold for 3 minutes, then came back and said they used to have a contract, but it had expired in October and had not been renewed. They still responded to calls from the neighborhood because the board president kept calling them directly, but they were not officially contracted anymore. I asked if she could confirm who had authorized the tow call that morning. She hesitated, then said it was Martha Clark, and that Martha had been calling them for snow violations at least twice a week since December. I asked if I could get copies of the dispatch logs. She said I would need to request them in writing, but she could confirm they existed. I hung up and immediately called a local news tip line, because I had learned from past HOA fights that documentation only matters if someone with leverage is watching. A staffer answered, and I gave him the short version: HOA liaison threatening illegal tows, fake fines, expired contracts. He told me to send photos, recordings, and any paperwork I had, and to document every interaction going forward. He said if I could prove a pattern, they might run it as a consumer protection story. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and built a timeline. Martha had threatened me on December 10th. The tow contract had expired on October 31st. That meant every tow call she had made in the last 6 weeks had been unauthorized. I pulled up my lease documents and found the section on dispute resolution. It said I could file a formal complaint with the management company if I believed a rule had been misapplied. I drafted a 2-page complaint, attached the printed snow policy, and included a request for all tow dispatch records related to Golden Oaks since November 1st. I submitted the complaint online that night, and I copied the news tip line staffer. Then I waited. The next morning I woke up to find a red-stamped final notice envelope shoved under my door. I opened it and found a bill for $200, labeled Winter Emergency Violation Mailbox Obstruction. The bill included a line item for administrative review, another $50. At the bottom, in bold print, it said failure to pay within 10 days would result in a lien filing and additional legal fees. I took photos of the envelope and the bill, then called the management company. The same clerk answered, and I told him I had received a fine for a rule that did not exist. He sighed and said he would forward my complaint to the board. I asked when I could expect a response. He said the board met once a month, and the next meeting was in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I could not wait 3 weeks. The notice said 10 days. I asked if there was an emergency hearing process. He said technically yes, but Martha would have to approve it since she was the one who filed the complaint. I hung up and checked my watch. I had 4 hours before my next service call, and I decided to use the time to talk to neighbors. I needed witnesses, and I needed to know if Martha had been doing this to other people. I started at the mailbox cluster, the spot where Martha had claimed my access was blocked. A man in his 60s was collecting his mail, bundled in a heavy coat. I introduced myself and asked if he had ever been fined for snow violations. He laughed, a bitter sound. "Everyone has," he said. "Martha hit me twice last year. Once for ice on my sidewalk, once for a snowbank that the plow left. I paid both times because I did not want the hassle." I asked if he had any paperwork. He said he threw it out, but he remembered the fees were always weird little surcharges and review costs that did not match the official fine schedule. He said most people in the neighborhood just paid because fighting Martha meant dealing with the board president, and the board president always sided with her. I thanked him and moved on. Over the next 2 hours, I knocked on 8 doors and talked to 6 people who answered. 4 of them had been fined by Martha in the last year. 2 had been threatened with tows. None of them had copies of the paperwork, but they all remembered the red-stamped envelopes and the same aggressive language about liens and legal fees. One woman told me she had tried to dispute a fine and the management company lost her packet twice, then told her the deadline had passed and she owed double. By noon, I had enough. I drove back to the management office and asked the clerk to pull the hearing records for the last 12 months. He said he could not give me other residents' files, but he could confirm that Martha had filed 43 complaints in the last year, and 38 of them had resulted in fines. I asked how many of those fines had been appealed. He checked the system and said 0. No one had appealed. I asked if I could request the board meeting minutes. He printed the last 6 months for me. I took them to my car and read through them. Martha's name appeared in every set of minutes, always as the compliance reporter. The board president, a man named Richard Moss, consistently moved to approve her recommendations without discussion. There were no dissenting votes, no questions, no oversight. It was a rubber stamp process. I called the news tip line staffer again and told him what I had found. He said it sounded like a pattern, but he needed hard evidence, something that showed intent or financial benefit. He suggested I look into whether Martha or the board president had any financial ties to the tow company or any vendors. That night, I filed a second records request with the management company, asking for all vendor contracts, payment records, and board member financial disclosures for the last 2 years. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to try. The clerk emailed me back within an hour and said the request would take up to 30 days to process. I did not have 30 days. The next morning, I got a call from Martha. She did not introduce herself, just started talking the moment I answered. "Your complaint has been reviewed and denied," she said. "The fine is upheld. You have 8 days to pay, or we move to lien." I asked who reviewed it. She said the board president. I asked when the review happened. She said this morning, via email vote. I asked for a copy of the vote. She said it was internal board business and not available to residents. I told her I had documentation proving the rule did not exist. She laughed. "This conversation is not a debate. It is a directive," she said. "Pay the fine or face the consequences." She hung up. I sat in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to keep calm. I was being railroaded and there was no internal process that would help me. The board was backing Martha, the management company was stalling, and I was running out of time. I decided to escalate. I called an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. He listened to my summary and said he could take the case, but it would cost at least $2,000 up front, and HOA disputes often dragged on for months. He said if I could prove the rule did not exist and the fine was fraudulent, I might be able to get an injunction, but it would take time. I told him I had 8 days. He said that was not enough time for a court filing. He suggested I try to resolve it at the board level first, and if that failed, he could help me sue for damages later. If you are enjoying this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA revenge tales where justice actually gets served. I hung up and checked my watch. I had 3 days before my next deadline, which was the meeting with the neighbor witness I had arranged earlier. His name was Paul, and he lived 2 doors down. He had agreed to meet me at the mailbox cluster because he said he had photos of Martha conducting what he called sidewalk measuring stunts, where she would show up with a ruler and measure snow depth like it was a crime scene. The day of the meeting, the weather turned brutal. Another storm rolled in overnight, dumping 6 inches of fresh snow and creating ice patches on every sidewalk. I cleared my driveway at dawn, salted the walkway, and made sure the mailbox cluster was accessible. I was not giving Martha any ammunition. Paul showed up at 10, bundled in a thick coat and carrying a phone. He was in his 40s, wiry and intense, the kind of guy who keeps receipts for everything. He showed me the photos. There were at least a dozen shots of Martha standing on various sidewalks, holding a ruler, taking measurements and writing notes on a clipboard. In one photo, she was crouched next to a curb, measuring the gap between a snowbank and the street. She does this every time it snows, Paul said. She targets people she does not like, measures their sidewalks, and files complaints if the snow is deeper than 3 inches. But the rule says you have 24 hours to clear after the snow stops. She files complaints while it is still snowing. I asked if he had ever been fined. He said yes, twice, both times while the storm was still active. He paid the first fine because he did not know better. The second time he tried to fight it, and that is when the management company lost his dispute packet twice and told him the deadline had passed. He said it felt deliberate. I told Paul about the expired tow contract and the fake addendum. His face went pale. She has been running this for how long, he asked. At least since November, I said. Maybe longer. I do not know how deep it goes yet, but I am going to find out. Paul said he would testify if it came to that. He also said there was a neighborhood group chat where people had been complaining about Martha for months, but no one had organized a formal pushback because everyone was afraid of retaliation. He offered to introduce me to a few key people who might be willing to help. I said yes. That night, Paul added me to the group chat. It was a private channel with about 30 members, and the conversation history was a goldmine. People had been sharing stories about Martha for over a year. One person posted a screenshot of a fine for ice accumulation that occurred during a freeze while they were out of town. Another posted a photo of a violation notice for a snowbank that the city plow had created. A third person said they had been fined for parking in their own driveway during a snow emergency, even though the emergency had been lifted before they got home. I scrolled through weeks of complaints, and a pattern emerged. Martha targeted people who worked irregular hours, people who traveled, and people who were new to the neighborhood. She would show up early in the morning or late at night, take photos, file complaints, and demand immediate payment. The fines were always accompanied by threats of liens, legal action, and towing. And the board always backed her up. I took screenshots of everything and forwarded them to the news tip line staffer. He responded within an hour and said he was interested, but he needed on-the-record sources. I told him I could deliver at least 3 people willing to talk. He said if I could get that, he would run the story. The next day, I got another red-stamped final notice envelope. This one said I had failed to pay the original fine, and the balance had increased to $350, including late fees and a second administrative review charge. It also said a lien filing was scheduled for the following Monday unless I paid in full by Friday. I called the management company and demanded an emergency hearing. The clerk said he would check with the board. 2 hours later, he called back and said the board had agreed to a hearing, but it would be held the next evening and I would only have 10 minutes to present my case. He also said Martha would be there, and the board president would chair the meeting. I asked if I could bring witnesses. He said no, residents only. I knew it was a setup. They were not going to let me win in a closed hearing with no witnesses and a 10-minute time limit. But I also knew I had to show up, because if I did not, they would claim I had refused to participate in the process and that would kill any future legal challenge. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I printed every document I had, the snow policy pages, the tow dispatch confirmation, the photos from Paul, the group chat screenshots, the meeting minutes showing the rubber stamp votes. I put it all in a tabbed binder, organized by date and category. I also prepared a 1-page summary of my complaint, written in plain language, with bullet points and highlighted sections. The hearing was held in a small conference room at the management office. When I arrived, the board president was already seated at the head of the table, flanked by 2 other board members I did not recognize. Martha sat off to the side, arms crossed, thin reading glasses perched on her nose. The clerk sat in the corner with a laptop, taking notes. The board president, Richard Moss, was a man in his 50s with silver hair and a suit that looked too expensive for a volunteer HOA position. He did not stand when I entered, just gestured to a chair and told me to sit. I placed my binder on the table. "You have 10 minutes, Richard said. Start now." I opened the binder and began. I explained that I had been fined for a rule that did not exist, that the tow threat had been based on an expired contract, and that Martha had been filing complaints without proper authorization. I showed them the printed snow policy pages and pointed out the absence of any mailbox access provision. I showed them the dispatch confirmation from the tow company. I showed them the meeting minutes with the rubber stamp votes. Richard listened without expression. The other board members looked uncomfortable. Martha stared at me with cold contempt. When I finished, Richard closed the binder without looking at it. "Your interpretation of the policy is incorrect," he said. "The mailbox access requirement is implied under the General Maintenance Clause. The board has the authority to enforce standards as needed to maintain property values. The fine is upheld." I asked how a non-existent rule could be implied. Richard said the board had discretion. I asked if the board had reviewed the expired tow contract. Richard said vendor management was an internal matter. I asked if the board was aware that Martha had been filing complaints without proper authorization. Richard said Martha was acting within her role as neighborhood watch liaison. I felt the walls closing in. They were not going to budge and they were not going to let me speak. I had one card left to play, and I decided to play it. "I have documentation showing a pattern of fraudulent enforcement," I said. "I have dispatch logs, witness statements, and records showing that at least 38 residents have been fined under rules that do not exist. I have also filed a formal records complaint with the management company, and I have contacted local media. If this fine is not reversed, I will go public with everything I have found." The room went silent. Martha leaned forward, her face tight with anger. "Keep arguing. You are making my case for me," she said. I turned to her. You said that to me once before. You said every word I say goes in the report. Well, I kept a report too. And mine has dates, photos, and recordings. So go ahead. Make your case. I will make mine. Richard cut in before Martha could respond. This hearing is over. The fine is upheld. You will receive written confirmation within 48 hours. If you wish to appeal, you may file a lawsuit. Good evening. He stood and walked out. The other board members followed. Martha stayed seated for a moment, staring at me, then she stood and left without a word. I was alone in the conference room with the clerk. He looked at me and shook his head. Off the record, you should file that lawsuit, he said. I walked out into the cold night air, binder in hand, feeling like I had just fought a brick wall. But I was not done. I had made a promise, and I was going to keep it. The next morning, I called the attorney again and told him I was ready to move forward. He said he could file an injunction request, but it would take at least a week, and there was no guarantee a judge would grant it before the lien deadline. I told him to file it anyway. He said he would need a retainer. I scraped together the money and sent it over. Then I called the news tip line staffer. I told him I had 3 on-the-record sources ready to talk, and I had documentation of a systematic enforcement fraud. He said he would send a reporter out that afternoon. The reporter was a woman in her 30s, sharp and direct. She met me at a coffee shop and I walked her through everything. The fake addendum, the expired contract, the rubber stamp board votes, the pattern of targeting vulnerable residents. I showed her the binder. She took photos of every page. Then she interviewed Paul and 2 other neighbors who agreed to go on camera. They told their stories, showed their red-stamped envelopes, and explained how the fines had hurt them financially. The reporter said the story would run in 2 days, pending legal review. She also said she was going to reach out to the tow company and the management company for comment. I asked her not to contact the HOA board until the story was ready to publish, because I did not want them to have time to prepare a response or retaliate against witnesses. She agreed. That night I got a call from Paul. He said Martha had been going door to door telling people that I was trying to destroy the neighborhood and that anyone who talked to the media would be fined for defamation. I told Paul to document every interaction and to keep his phone recording. He said he already was. The next day, the attorney called and said the injunction hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, the same day the lien was supposed to be filed. He said it would be close, but he thought we had a shot. I asked what I needed to do. He said, show up, bring the binder, and be ready to testify. That Friday, the news story went live. It was a 5-minute segment on the evening broadcast, with interviews, documents, and a clear narrative. HOA liaison runs fake fine scheme. Board enables fraud. Residents pay thousands in bogus fees. The story included a comment from the tow company, confirming that their contract had expired and that Martha had been calling them without authorization. The management company declined to comment. The HOA board did not respond. Within an hour, the story was shared across neighborhood social media. The group chat exploded. People who had been silent for months started posting their own stories. Someone created a spreadsheet to track fines, and within 2 hours it had over 50 entries. The pattern was undeniable. That night, I got a call from the management company. It was not the clerk, it was a regional manager I had never spoken to before. She introduced herself and said she had seen the news story. She said the company was conducting an immediate audit of all Golden Oaks fines and fees for the last 2 years, and that all pending liens were suspended pending the outcome. She also said Martha had been placed on a no-contact directive by management, meaning she was not allowed to file complaints or contact residents directly until the audit was complete. I asked what that meant for my fine. She said it was under review, and I would receive a formal response within a week. I asked if the board president was also under review. She hesitated, then said all board actions were being reviewed. I thanked her and hung up. The following Monday, I went to the injunction hearing. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had clearly read the case file. The HOA board sent an attorney, a young guy who looked like he had been handed the case that morning. My attorney presented the evidence: the fake addendum, the expired contract, the rubber stamp votes, the news story, the audit suspension. The board's attorney tried to argue that the fine was valid under the general maintenance clause, but the judge cut him off. "Do you have any evidence that the rule exists in writing?" she asked. The attorney admitted he did not. The judge turned to me. "Do you have evidence that the rule does not exist?" I handed over the printed snow policy pages. The judge read them, then looked at the board's attorney. "The injunction is granted. The fine is void. The lien filing is prohibited. The HOA will refund all amounts paid by the plaintiff. The board is ordered to provide written notice to all residents that the mailbox access rule does not exist and any fines issued under that rule are void." Next case. I walked out of the courthouse into the cold December air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. The fight was not over. The audit was still happening, and I did not know what would come of it, but I had won the immediate battle. The fine was gone. The lien was blocked. And Martha's favorite fee structure had collapsed in front of a judge. The audit took 3 weeks. When the results came in, they were damning. The management company found that Martha had filed over 200 complaints in the last 2 years, resulting in fines totaling more than $60,000. Of those complaints, 94 were based on rules that did not exist or were misapplied. Another 37 were filed while violations were still active, meaning residents had not yet reached the deadline to comply. The audit also found that the tow contract had been expired for 14 months, and Martha had authorized at least 18 tows during that period without board approval. The management company issued refunds to 41 residents, totaling over $18,000. They also sent a formal letter to every resident explaining the findings and apologizing for the enforcement failures. The letter included new procedures for filing complaints, a requirement that all fines be reviewed by an independent compliance officer, and a ban on any board member or liaison issuing fines unilaterally. Martha resigned from her position as Neighborhood Watch liaison 2 days after the audit results were published. The board president, Richard Moss, resigned a week later. The remaining board members called a special election to fill the vacancies, and 3 new members were elected, all of them vocal critics of the previous administration. The city also got involved. After reviewing the audit findings in the news story, a code enforcement officer reached out to the HOA and issued a written warning over snow route interference. The warning said the HOA had been misrepresenting city snow emergency rules and that any future violations would result in fines against the board itself. The HOA board quickly reversed its snow removal policy to align with actual city regulations, and the emergency parking restrictions were clarified to match state law. I stayed in my rental for another 6 months, and in that time the neighborhood changed. People started attending board meetings. The group chat became an organizing tool. The new board members pushed for transparency, and the management company hired a compliance officer who actually followed the rules. It was not perfect, but it was better. Paul and I stayed in touch. He told me that after the audit, at least a dozen residents had filed small claims suits against the HOA for wrongful fines, and most of them settled out of court. He also said Martha had moved out of Golden Oaks entirely, relocating to a condo across town. No one knew where Richard had gone, and no one cared. As for me, I moved on. I found a better place. A quiet duplex with no HOA and no drama. But I kept the binder. I kept the red stamped envelopes. I kept the screenshots and the dispatch logs and the photos. And whenever someone asked me about HOA horror stories, I told them about Golden Oaks. And I told them how I fought back. The whole thing taught me something important. Documentation is power. Every email, every photo, every recording, every receipt, every timestamp matters. Because when the system is rigged against you, the only way to win is to prove it, loudly and publicly, with evidence no one can ignore. I am glad you made it to the end.